Okay, so starting from beginning. The most basic kind of program that you'll ever write is a console application.
Yeah.
And when you write it, you'll be given a template,
Yeah.
usually a class called program.cs,
Yeah.
and a bunch of using statements, namespace, which is the same as your project name, and here you go, you see class program and main method.
Yeah.
So that's quite clear, and you might start wondering what using does. And
Yeah.
using,
I kind of get what using does.
using, well, for example, in our project we have, in our solution, this bot, we have 3 projects in total. It's this bot, this bot console test, and unit tests. This bot project is another project, and I don't have access to it by default in my console application. And more specifically, if I would go to CoreBot in this bot's namespace, uh, if I would go to CoreBot in this bot program, I would see this bot namespace. And essentially, what using means is that I'm using that namespace. So that means I'm using this bot's namespace.
Yeah.
So that is that. So what is a namespace? A namespace is a folder. It's a virtual folder. It doesn't have to be real, but preferably it should. So for example, I have my uh, console test project and
Yeah.
program class. And since it's like at the root of this project, its namespace is this bot console test.
Yeah.
So let's say I make another folder and call it um, console components,
Yeah.
and I create a new item, a new class inside the console components, and I
Yeah.
will call it console manager, let's say.
Yeah.
Uh, and I'll say public static because I want to call it without the need of creating an instance of it. So public static void,
Yeah.
and um, mm, prompt, and then string message, and
Yeah.
then let's say console.write line please, and then message, let's say something as dull as this. So if I would want to use this into my program, I would need to be um, doing this
Yeah.
console manager dot prompt,
Yeah.
and then some message. But you see it's an error, and it says that does not exist. And it doesn't exist because I'm not using that namespace. I am in a different namespace, and that class does not exist in my namespace. So I need to refer to that namespace. And
Yeah.
that's the full name of namespace. This is what the namespace is suggested. The root of the project and then folder where the file is, but it doesn't have to be this way. But if you keep to this kind of naming convention, then it will be much better to organize your stuff.
Yeah.
Another thing to note about using is that what it does under the hood is copy pastes everything that you have in this namespace. There can
Yeah.
be multiple files that are within that namespace, and it will copy paste under the hood the code which is inside each of the namespaces that you're using the using keyword. So now it's not underlined anymore, and we can write something.
Yeah.
All right. And press any key to continue. So now from the very basics, each
Oh, you've gone robot.
what?
You went robot for a second.
Ah, okay.
You're fine now.
So that's the namespace virtual folder, and
Yep.
those brackets basically form a scope. Each of those brackets have to close, and whatever is in the scope, let's say scope of main function, does not exist outside of it. So if I have something in a deeper scope outside that scope, less deep, that doesn't exist. But stuff from less deeper scopes exist inside more deeper scopes. Now I have class program and nothing is written in the class, and this means the same as internal class, because internal means it's only visible in this namespace, nowhere else. Class is like factory for objects, but in this case it doesn't do much except that it holds an entry point where our application starts. And actually you don't have to write everything inside this specific class in this method. If you click properties in your thisbot console test, and if you go to
assembly info
into sorry, what?
I'm on properties, right?
Yeah.
It comes up with assembly info.
Application.
Is that the wrong properties?
Maybe. No. Right click on the project, not on the properties.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my bad.
And then you can see the output type, it's console application, and start a project. If it's not set, it picks whatever is pre-generated by default, but you can set which class starts your application startup object. So we can select program, and then it will try to call main of program. So that's why it works like right now. So main is a starting point of our application. Every application has one. It really varies. For example, console application, it's usually program and main. For example, if you were to write an add-in for Excel, it has something done under the hood, but essentially you have startup, shutdown events where you can launch your code and start running it from there. So it really varies per application, but every application has a starting point. So in our application, we have console.writeLine to print text to console. Console in this case is a class, and writeLine is a static method of that class. It's a static method because we don't need to create an instance of console to call writeLine. And void, you can see, is a type for function which returns nothing. And a function is defined in the following way. I will go down to go back to the thisbot class, and we have corebot class, where we have a list of possible curses. A list is basically something which can store many of the same type. Type is string.
Yeah.
String is for storing basically text variables.
Yeah.
So there is our constructor. Constructor is defined using the same name as the class. We have CoreBot class, and our constructor's name is CoreBot. And this is
Yeah.
a default constructor because the parameters list is empty. Just like a
Yeah.
function, constructor can have parameters. For example, we have public void add function. Type returns nothing, so it's void. And we want to add curses to our curse list, so we can have this. This case is actually pretty bad because we don't really need to call it like this. We could just call it directly. But this, what this saves us is that we don't need to say corebot.possiblecurses.add, and we can just say corebot.add because it's a method
Yeah.
of a class and none of that. It's okay, but not a must for sure. And we have last method to pick response, and currently it works as our Discord's nugget bot. If there is keyword Y in
Yeah.
your question, then a response will be because your mom is gay, always.
Yeah.
And that's how it acts. So pick response method has a return type. That's why it's string.
Yeah.
And each method in a class has an access modifier. It can be either private, protected, or public. So private means that it cannot be accessed outside the scope of that class. Same goes for protected, except for protected, you can still access it in the inheriting classes. If you have a class which inherits another class, if that class which inherited another class had a protected property, then it will be inherited as well. But that property, if it was private, it would not be inherited. That's why we use protected.
Wait, can you explain that again? The protected bit.
So now we have CoreBot, right?
Yeah.
And let's say I wanted to make CurseBot, okay?
Yeah.
CoreBot, CurseBot from CoreBot, CurseBot. So both classes are public because I want to use it outside of this project. So CurseBot inherits CoreBot.
Yeah.
And let's go back to CoreBot and let's make something protected. For now, protected, let's see what could be protected. What would we not expose from this class, but we would want to use? Let's say we would like to store last picked curse ID so that we reduce the chance, like so that we don't pick the same curse twice. It makes sense. So protected int last picked curse index, and it kind of makes set and get here to write set and get because we don't know how many classes will inherit this, and if we make changes we'll have to change every one of those, so it kind of makes sense writing set and get here for the future in case we change in many places. So if that one was private, And if I go to CurseBot and write the constructor, and let's say I would like to call that one in the constructor, it says it's inaccessible due to protection level.
Yeah.
And if I change the access modifier to protect it, and I go back to the thing, and it's fine, we can use it now.
All right. So where is that used in like industry?
Always, which part, which one do you mean? Private, protected?
I mean, protected.
Well, when you have inheritance,
Yeah.
and you want to inherit something, you always use protected. When you want to inherit it. When you don't want to inherit, let's say when you have something that is usable only by the parent and not the child, then you hide it, writing private, hide it from the child, because let's say not an industry scenario, but a real life scenario. Let's say a father has a list of previous women before your mom, and you want to hide that list from your child, so it would be private. And then you could say that mother is protected or public or whatever, but that's well, when you want to expose it, you write protected to expose it to children. Okay, so that's that. Now set and get is like a shortcut for setting and getting properties. Instead, you could write a private int last picked curse index, and this definition would be exactly the same as you set the value of a field and you get the value of that field. So this is what set and get does under the hood. Get this. By default, this whole thing gets auto-generated, and it gives us auto-suggest that we basically wrote the same as the auto property, so we can use the suggestion, and this is what it suggests us to change to set and get, because it's the same. So we have this, we have our default constructor, a list of possible curses, a method to add a curse, and a method to pick a response. Now, we go back to our console application, and oh shit, we deleted some. Oh wait, we didn't. We have our program class. So we go back to our program class, and if we hit Control F5, we can run the console application. So let's see what happens. The console prompts us ask a question, then we read a line with console read line. So whatever we put in a line, why is it going so slow? So whatever we put in a line, it gets read when we hit enter. So I hit enter, and our bot prompted us with a reply because your mom is gay. So we created the new bot instance using new keyword, and we added a curse to the bot because your mom is gay, and response picked, and bot picked the response based on user input. It asked the question with why, and that's it. So we outputted the response in console, and we prompt it with the console manager to press any key to continue. And if we press any key, it stops. We actually had to press any key, so maybe a read line or something. Don't know. Read line. So let's make it a bit more interesting.
Is there any
So
way you can get it to run on my computer? Is that like a privilege that you can set, or?
I don't think so. I will need
Alright.
to research this, why it works like this, or is it, if it's possible. I don't know yet. It's only one day that I've been using it, so I don't know. So the thing that we could do right now is to keep asking user a question until he writes something special.
Yeah.
So while do while actually better. Yeah,
Actually, wait. I
do
think
while
I
is
can.
better. Yeah.
Oh, wait. I just want to see if I can. Oh, no, I don't actually have the build on my computer. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. Alright, I'm back.
Okay. User text string dot compare user text and is not to lower user text doesn't exist. Oh crap, it's outside the scope. So let's say we keep asking user a question while string compare to the condition to 0. So we ask user a question, and then he does that, and then oops, then we say press any key to continue, console.readline, and then we ask a question again.
Yeah.
And we read the line, not here but there.
Yeah.
So if the new user text is not okay, it's supposed to be not.
Yeah. Then it will keep on
asking.
Yeah.
But we don't need to keep creating a bot. That's one point.
Yeah.
We just need to pick a response. So if we run this again with Control F5, we get ask a question. Why are you making me do this? Because your mom is gay. Press any key to continue. And then again, ask a question. Are you okay? There was no response. So it didn't curse us.
Yeah.
It curses us only when we say why? Because your mom is gay again. And if we say okay, it stops.
Yeah.
So this is like the most basic kind of program. And if you didn't know yet, while is one of the
Yeah,
loops.
no, I know that. I know that. Yeah.
And the other kind of loops are
Like for in each or
for and
for
for
each.
each. And that's it for loops. Uh, Recursion is another type of loop, but that's for later time.
Yeah.
Now, to demonstrate how loops work and arrays work, we could. Array is a bit annoying, but I will do an array. Var,
Arrays kind of like lists.
kind of like list, but more annoying because you need to manage it yourself. You need to set
Yeah.
a size, and that size is fixed. And then if you want to expand it, you need to do it manually, and list handles it like a boss.
Yeah.
So if I wanted to write an array, also I didn't mention var keyword. It predicts a type. Under the hood, there is a type, but it gets predicted based on what you wrote on the right side of the equality sign. You
Yeah.
cannot write var something because it cannot predict a type on when you don't assign anything. It doesn't know what it is, and it cannot know what it is.
Yeah.
So var bot, we created new bot. It's obvious it's gonna be a bot. We read a console. We read line from a console. It's obvious that it's text, so type is string. It picks automatically, and you should use var almost always, except in
Yeah.
the cases when you would like to know what the type is, and you cannot determine the type by just looking at it, looking at what your function does. For example, if I wrote a function, something like private static uh, int, and then random function name, and then I return 0, and then if I do nonsense like var something is that nonsense, I should
Yeah.
not write var in this case. It still works,
Sure.
but someone who reads the code will hover over this var to know what it is. On the other
Yeah.
hand, if I don't care what this is, like let's say I just want to convert it to string, and then console.write line, pass it as a string, then it's fine writing a var because it doesn't really change the fact that it will be still converted to string unless the conversion gets influenced a lot by the type. So
Yeah.
those are the few cases that you should consider when writing a var or not. In this case, I would write int because I have no idea what comes back from this function.
Yeah.
A little bit about static. Static is shared across the whole class. So even if I
Yeah.
let's say create 10 programs, all of those 10 programs will have this one method, and I can say public static int index, let's say, and this index will be shared across all instances of program class. If I make 10 programs somewhere, then index will be still one index. And I will access it
Yeah.
not using instance of a program, but class itself, because it's shared across classes,
Yeah.
across that class. So it's one for all across all the instances of it, or just the class.
Yeah.
And just the class. So that's fine. We have something, sure, we don't need this. It was an example, bad example. We don't need this. So I wanted to make an example of an array. So um, responses.
Yeah.
So when should we use array? In this case, let's say I want to store all the responses that I prompted, all the questions I gave to the bot and all the responses it gave me. I would like to store that somewhere, okay? So
Yeah.
I could use an array like this. So I create an array of uh, strings, and then I need to pass how many strings will there be? What's the size of the array? And I don't know, and that's why it's problematic. But I will,
Yeah.
for the sake of testing, write 5. And as an example, I will create a list of questions that the bot gave me in the order.
Yeah.
So I create a new list of strings, and I don't need to pass um, a um, size because it is being used dynamically. It's being expanded when I add elements. So one thing to note about this is that by using list, I need to use namespace or assembly, in other words, system collections generic.
Yeah.
That's what I need to use because that's where the logic for list is. Otherwise, my program doesn't know what the list is. So I say int response index is 0, and I pick response. I pick a response and store it in the responses array. So I say responses, I made a typo, responses response index is response.
Yeah.
And I add to the index, I increment the index by 1, either like
Yeah.
this with plus plus or like this. Those are the same since it's redundant to write it like that, so I just put it like this or like this, third way, but
Yeah.
I prefer plus plus adds 1. So we got our response, we added 1 to the index. It would probably make the most sense to add the index at the very end just in case we use it on other parts consistently.
Yeah.
And question, pick a response. What was the question? Ask a question. It was the read line thing that we had. And did I delete it? I didn't delete it. User text was our question.
Yeah.
So questions was a better name for list items. So questions, and I add to the questions list the user text.
Yeah.
And so I add this to the questions, bot picks response, I add the response to the response array, I write the response down, and then I prompt to press a key to continue. Then I read any key. More like I read any line. Press
Yeah.
enter to continue would make sense. Press enter to continue. So I asked to press enter basically with read line. And I write line, ask a question. And then I repeat basically this whole while
Yeah.
until the response is okay. Now to make this more clear, I will make a few adjustments. So I'll write var questions terminator, and this is what terminates questions, what ends my program.
Yeah, yeah.
And this whole condition, I will move it as a property of this program. So I will say I cannot move it as a property, that's why I'll move it as a method. Bool is
Yeah.
more like can ask another question, and I pass in user text, input text, user text.
Yeah.
And then that's the condition for if it can ask another text. If user text is equal to questions terminator, then it can ask another question. So I
Yeah.
check while that condition is true, which is while I can ask another question, I keep asking another question. And why is this bad? Because it's static. It's supposed to be static.
Yeah.
Okay, so now if we run this again, ask a question, why is it okay? And then say mom is gay, and then press any key to continue, ask a question, and then the question is okay, continue, and it's done. And let's print in the end all the responses and all the questions.
Yeah.
So for each, for loop, let's say I'll use for int var I, since I don't care what it is, 0, I less than questions questions yeah, questions dot length count.
Yeah.
That's the count of questions list, and plus plus. Oh sure, I do and say that the question was questions of that index, and the response was if so this is logical condition. If I didn't mention it yet, if means that we're checking some condition, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like a control of our program.
Yeah.
So if string dot is null or empty our response of the same index,
Yeah.
then we more like this. It makes more sense. If we had a response for a question, then we prompt a question and a response. Otherwise, we don't. So
Yeah.
so questions I, responses I, and we move all this into another function because we have too many things. We already have way too many things in the main.
Yeah.
So private static void print questions and answers.
Yeah.
And we pass in the list of questions and an array of answers.
Yeah.
And if our answer was empty, we consider that there was no question answered, so there's no need to print it there. And then we call this in the end to have our questions and responses, or in other words, answers. And we could have this to put in a separate function, and we should, but for now it's fine. All right, it keeps on asking. So let's test it. Control F5, run, ask a question. Why are you here? Because your mom is gay. Ask a question. Why? 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 So we wrote 4 times why. We wrote the 5th
Yeah.
time why. And guess what happens when we write the 6th time why?
It broke
Why?
because you set the string to
No, no, no,
5.
because your mom is gay. Because this program is gay. That's why. So it breaks. I will leave the handling of exceptions for the later time, but
Yeah,
just
something like try catch and things like that.
yes, it's try catch,
Yeah.
but it's for the next stream.
Yeah. Yeah.
And basically, that's the bad thing about arrays. They work faster than lists, way faster, but they need to be managed much more carefully. And if you know exactly how many elements you will have, then go ahead and use array. But if you don't, then
Yeah.
you're better off using a list. If you
Yeah.
really care about performance, you'll probably make it optimal using array with dynamic expansion and stuff. But in most cases, and practically in most business applications, you will see list for a collection of elements used most commonly. So to wrap this up, we learned that each program has a starting point and it varies.
Yep.
Console application, it's picked in the properties of console, and you set a startup object, which is essentially something which has main method, and that main method is your starting point in a console application. The parts of
Yeah.
program here you can see is using, which means you're using some namespace. If someone wanted to use our this spot console test, they would have to say using this spot console test. Even something, so namespace is like a folder which
Yeah.
starts
Yeah.
at the root of your project and goes deeper. More folders you have, more nested folders are, the deeper the path goes. It should be that way. It doesn't have to be that way, but if you follow the convention, then it will be easier to manage your project like this.
Yeah.
And by default, a class is internal if you don't write any access modifier. So internal, and this is the same.
Yeah.
It can be public and protected. Sorry, it cannot be protected. It can only be public
Yeah.
and or internal. it doesn't have private access modifier like a property does. So this is a property. We already covered that this is a shortcut for what else we would have to specify with a private field. The difference between field and a property is that a property has setter and getter, and field does not. Field is like a variable for a class. Property is something which sets and gets value of another field, and in this case it's automatically done for us. Okay. Wow, what is an access modifier for a field or property? It's public, protected, or private. In general, most of the time, if you want to expose your variable in a class, do public. If you don't, do private. If you have inheritance and want the inheritance to persist, inheritance of those variables, then do protected. Here you have static. Static means it's shared. Static for class means it cannot be created because it's shared. So there's only one of that class. So you cannot create new instances. So void means no return type. String means I return. Bool means I return logical value. String means I return text. So that's what the function can have among many other types. Now here I pass in string array as parameters for main method, which gets executed when I start my program with Ctrl F5. That's the default shortcut, and it does a bunch of stuff. While and for each are examples. Not examples, but basically the only ways how you handle loops. So 3 ways with while, for, and for each loops. You can make a loop to do something many times of the same. To store many of the same, you use array. To store something of the same in a more generic way, which is done for you, is done through list. Now, if you want to create an instance of a class, you use new keyword. A class is factory for objects, basically. So that is that. And if I didn't mention one last thing, if I have 2 projects, like in this case, I have this bot console test and this bot. In order to use the other project that I don't have, I need to add a reference to it. So I go to references, and if it's of the same solution, then I can just simply browse the projects from solution and select the one I have. In my case, this bot, I use this bot and I add reference to it. Last but not least, what is a solution? So if you would split your program into scope sections, solution is basically it's actually nothing. It's just a bunch of projects which you can stack in one place. That's a solution. Then inside a project, you have a bunch of namespaces. Inside of namespaces, you have a bunch of classes. Inside of classes, you have methods. And inside of methods, you can have for loops or something else which reduces the scope even more. So that's the scope hierarchy. And you cannot access something which is outside your scope, which means if my scope is smaller than something, like if something bigger tries to ask something from a smaller scope, well, then usually you need to do something to include that smaller scope, because that is usually out of your scope. In other words, if my thisbot project wants to access thisbot console test, I need to add reference to it. If I want to use another namespace, I need to write using keyword. If I want to use one variable from some function and pass it to another function. Well, I need to pass it through variables, but scope doesn't let me to do it in a global way, which is good because we want to save our resources.
Yeah.
So lastly, name your shit well because it makes it much more readable, and the most part you spend reading your program and not writing code, and that's why simply by spending a bit more time naming your things, variables, properties, and functions and classes better will save a lot of time like this. So
Yeah.
that is all about this lesson. Do you have any questions?
No, you explained everything really good. You should really charge for this, by the way.